and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my original fiction. So, the story this week isn't part of Edie Valley. This is because it is the first chapter, or I guess the prologue, I should say, of a novel I wrote my senior year of high school. It is one that I hope to eventually get published, thusly I will not be able to read the entire thing on the channel. However, I will read the first 3 chapters. The first one is, again, a prologue, so it's the first 2 chapters, but, whatever. In hopes to maybe, build some hype for it, see how interested people are in hearing more about it. So this novel is more of a fantasy novel than you guys are used to. One of the reasons I made Edie Valley a modern day setting is because I had spent the last year writing in a fantasy setting and I needed to have a break and get something different. I'm gonna freely admit, I took a lot of inspiration from Legend of Zelda on this story, but I made it different enough that there's no way, Nintendo can sue me, or that, you'll even know the influences there unless I've told you, or you're a huge Zelda fan. You go, wait a second. Because I really like the concept of the fact that all the games take place over this huge timeline, and that, there were still some constants throughout the timeline and how things changed over the course of history. So I really wanted to explore that. So this novel is essentially takes place in 6 different times with 6 different main characters and casts of characters. And the only constant really being the land itself, the country of Theone, which its name changes several times, but takes place over a course of about 1,000 years. So it's an interesting thing I tried, and it's, now over, it's 170,000 words, so yeah, this took me a good 9 or 10 months to write, and I still haven't finished editing it yet, but I have edited the first 3 chapters, so without further ado, here is Theone, the prologue. The boy always knew that he was different from the other children, the other people of his village. It wasn't wishful thinking on his part, a hope that he could be more, something greater than the small hamlet in which he made his home. It was a simple fact. "Why don't you go out and play with the other boys?" his aunt would ask. But the boy didn't like the other boys. The other boys were big and brawny. The other boys were strong enough to help with the harvesting. The other boys liked to wrestle and play rough. The boy was not like the other boys, no matter how much he sometimes wished it were so. He was small and agile, with his head stuck in the clouds, as his aunt would always say. Maybe he wouldn't have been considered so odd if he'd been born in the great city of Theone, where thousands of people of all sorts lived and worked every day. But in the small village, which was solely populated with farmers who lived in small thatched roof houses, being different or abnormal was certainly not a good thing. Perhaps this was why, when the other children of the village would run through the mud and dirt and play after their chores were done, the boy would wander off to the woods and play make-believe. He would never wander too far, however, because the woods were deep and dark, and strange things lurked in its depths like spirits and witches and other things that would very much like to gobble up a young child for supper. For the darkest depths of the forest were more than a swamp than anything, dangerous for one so young. The boy never went that far. Sometimes, while he was out there playing by himself, he thought about his mother and how she would have understood his plight. The boy didn't know why he thought that. He had never known his mother. She had died soon after he'd been born, but for some reason he just knew that wherever she was watching out for him. Watching was all fine and well with the boy, except that he so often wished that she was here with him, to smile and laugh and to hold him when he cried. Sure, he had his aunt. She was, at the very least, kind to him, but she had never understood him, never understood her sister. "She was always daydreaming, your mum, never much use around the house, but when she sang, people would come for miles around just to hear her hum a tune." He could hear her sometimes, he was sure of it, singing, up in the old ruins in the forest far from the village, on top of a hill that reached up like a hand. Whenever he heard its tinkling notes singing that oddly familiar melody, the boy would stop and look around at the other villagers, but no one else seemed to hear it, so he kept his mouth shut. There was no need for the other children to think him crazy in addition to strange. They made fun of him, mostly for his dreamy disposition and his tendency to glance absently up at the marble ruins that glinted like bones in the sunlight. The biggest, and stupidest, he liked to think, of the children was a boy named Bick, who was the most vicious in his teasing. He spit at the boy, called him names, would have probably beaten the boy senseless if he had been fast enough. On the day that our story begins, he was especially vindictive, and chased the boy into a wheat field, a sadistic look in his eyes. "Come here, you little bastard!" Bick shouted as he chased the boy through the field, the golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze over their heads. "I'll kick your teeth in!" The boy looked back for a moment, and let out a small yelp as he saw just how close Bick had gotten, no more than a few yards behind him, far too close to comfort. "That's exactly why I'm running," he called back. "If you tell me exactly what you're going to do to me when you catch me, then I'm just going to go faster." "What?" Bick asked, clearly not able to think and run at the same time. "Oh, yeah," continued the boy, trying his hardest to make Bick think about something, distract him from putting one foot in front of the other. "I've been wondering something. Why teeth?" What about them?" Bick was beginning to pant. "Good." The boy smiled. "Why kick my teeth in specifically? I mean, I could think of at least 100 different ways for you to beat the snot out of me. Why teeth?" Bick paused, slowing to a jog for a moment. "I don't know." His scarce amount of brain cells rubbing together in vain. "It sounded like a good idea at the time. You know, nice and intimidating." Perfect. The slight pause, that singular moment of indecision, had given the boy just enough time to scramble out... That single moment of indecision had given the boy just enough time to scramble out of the field, spitting hayseeds out of his teeth into the shelter of the forest just beyond. The leaves swayed above his head as he stopped to catch his breath, wading a few yards into the ancient mossy trees, ready to run. He waited there to see what Bick would do. The bigger boy paused just outside the reach of the embracing branches. He shuffled from foot to foot, unsure of what to do. Scared. That was the only way to describe his face, which was highly unusual for Bick. The boy had certainly seen him run through a lot of emotions, but fear was not one of them. Hey, Bick stuttered, his words echoing oddly through the trees. "No fair. We're not supposed to go in the woods." "Are you scared?" asked the boy, gleefully throwing verbal stones back at his tormentor for once in his life. "Afraid the spirits are gonna curse you forever?" He cackled and waved his hands through the air while making ooh noises. At last, he had turned the tables. He had found something Bick was afraid of. Now it was Bick's turn to be scared for his life. Said bully clenched his fists and puffed out his sizable girth into what was supposed to be a manly show of courage. It didn't work. "I'm not scared of anything." Stupid, stupid Bick. Everyone knew that only idiots were scared of nothing. "Come and get me, then." Bick hesitated, running through his options. Then, after taking a deep breath to steel himself, he grinned maliciously and cracked his knuckles. "All right, if you say so," he said as he began to first walk, then jog, and finally run into the forest after the boy. "Uh-oh," said the boy, his eyes widening. This was not what he'd expected to happen. He took off like a rabbit, jumping over roots and rocks as quickly as his legs could carry him. Luckily, he knew these woods, at least the outskirts, probably better than anyone in the village, certainly better than Bick. He could use this to his advantage. Soon, however, his breath began to come out rough and ragged. The boy wasn't sure just how long he could keep this up. Bick half ran, half stumbled through the brush after him, stomping through like an elephant. Was he trying to make as much noise as possible? "Wait!" he called, panting as he began to slowly but surely lose ground. "No fair! You're faster than I am! Come back!" The boy just laughed. In what world did it make the tiniest bit of sense for him to turn around? None. None was the answer. Unless, of course, you were talking about a world where getting beaten senseless was the equivalent of a nice, friendly hug. This was not that world. The boy was certainly glad that he didn't live there. "Having trouble keeping up?" he asked over his shoulder. "What's wrong? Cursed by the spirits already?" He kept running for a moment before he realized that there had been no response. The boy slowed to a jog. "Bick?" Still nothing. The dunderhead was trying to get him to turn around so he could smack him a good one. He knew it. But still, there wasn't a single sound save the rustling of the leaves in the trees. The boy stopped and, taking a deep breath, sure that he would come to regret it, turned around. But Bick wasn't there. Not on the overgrown path behind him, nor hiding behind a tree or bush. "Bick?" the boy asked again. Nothing reached his ears but silence. Even the birds had ceased their high-pitched tweeting. Shivering, the boy realized just how cold it was. The woods were beginning to grow dark, and the sun shone through the trees directly behind him, shockingly close to setting. Was it that late already? "Come on, Bick, this isn't funny," he called, hoping vainly that Bick would run out of the foliage that moment, shouting, "Boo!" But alas, no surprise attack followed. Then a noise, a howling of distant wolves, echoed through the vegetation, and the boy whimpered. He purported to be an expert of the woods, but he had never been in it at night. It would still be okay, though, right? He just had to retrace his steps, go back the way he came, and he was completely turned around. The ground had become soft and moist beneath his boots, and the drooping branches on the trees loomed menacingly overhead. He didn't think that he had ever gone this far into the forest. Then, right next to his ear, he heard a rustling noise. Spirits? Wolves? He didn't wait to find out. The boy jumped and grabbed a stick off of the ground, brandishing it in front of him like a sword. Even though it was only some old, rotting branch, it made the boy feel a little better to not be completely defenseless. He swung it through the air, testing it. Again, and it whirled solidly through the air as he did so. Once more, however, and it stopped mid-swing. "Be careful where you swing that thing," said a voice, thick and knotted like tree bark, and the boy yelped as he looked up and saw an ancient, wrinkled face staring down at him like he was a piece of meat. The old crone let go of the boy's makeshift weapon with a scratchy chuckle, and then laughed still harder when the boy leapt back and brandished it in front of him, as if a simple stick could possibly protect him. His hand shook slightly as the crone shook her head and sighed. Who are you?" the boy demanded, cursing the quaver in his voice. "Me?" asked the crone, placing a knotted hand on her chest in mock surprise. "I'm just a little old lady taking a stroll all by herself in the woods at night." Eyes narrowing, the boy gripped his stick tighter. "You're lying." "What makes you say that?" asked the crone after another wheezing laugh escaped her lips. "But you, my dear boy, will never truly know, will you?" I can make you talk," said the boy, trying his darndest to sound intimidating as he talked straight out of his arse. So tell me just who you are and how to get out of here before I—" And here he made a solid attempt at a low growl, but he was pretty sure that he sounded more akin to a cat with a hairball. "Have to get ugly." The crone smiled, not unkindly, showing her yellowed, crooked teeth. Then, closing the distance between them without resistance, she patted him on the head. The boy had half expected her to smell like musk and decay, what with the ancient beyond measure torn scrap of a cloak that almost seemed melted to her body and greasy, matted hair. Surprisingly, the smell that reached his nose was instead more akin to the aroma of pine needles and the odd yet slightly satisfying smell of a dog that's just had a bath. "I hate to break it to you, boy, but I don't think you could hurt a fly, let alone an old lady." The boy dropped the stick abruptly, the fight leaving him. She was right. He knew that. As much as he could pretend, the boy could never hurt anyone. Not even Bick. It simply wasn't in his nature. "Now," continued the crone, sitting slowly, arthritically on an old stump, "why don't you tell me what you're doing out here at such an hour?" Shuffling around, feeling almost as if he was being scolded, the boy looked down at his feet. "I was being chased." It was almost a whisper. "Eh? Being chased?" asked the crone, putting a hand on her ear as if unsure of whether or not she had heard him correctly. "By who?" "A bully," the boy admitted. "Bully." The crone scrunched her already wrinkled face in disgust. "The worst kind of scum." He could tell that on a certain level she was just humoring him, but it helped anyway. The boy smiled, regaining back a sliver of his confidence. "His name is Bick, and he's really big and stupid, and he's always picking on me." The crone looked interested, more so than any other adult who he'd ever told of his plight. "I thought that if I ran into the woods, then I could get away, but then I looked back, and he was gone." He gasped then, eyes wide as something awful occurred to him. What if the spirits really are real? What if they've got him? Or a swamp witch kidnapped him and is going to eat him for supper? The crone simply laughed. The boy puffed out indignantly. "What if he's in trouble?" But she waved off the question, coughing slightly. "That boy is fine," she said. "He simply got scared and ran home is all." "Wait." The boy paused. "How do you know? Were you watching us?" he demanded. "I was simply wondering what in the goddess's name was making that awful racket." "But if Bick's home," the boy's train of thought continued without heed, "then he'll tell everyone that we were in the woods. My aunt will kill me if I don't get back." He began to turn around wildly, trying desperately to get his bearings. "I have to get back." The crone stood up, grunting as she did so. "My dear child," she said calmly, "I think you've gone quite a bit farther into the woods than you realize." She paused, looking up at the quickly emerging moon. "No, there's simply no way to get you home tonight, what with the wolves and all." "But I have to get home," the boy shouted. "I can't spend the night out here." "My house is not far from here," the crone sighed. "You can spend the night there, and I'll take you back to your village in the morning." She held out her hand, but the boy hesitated. "My aunt said not to go anywhere with strangers. She's told me stories, you know, about witches who lure children into the swamp to eat them." Throwing her head back as a hearty laugh rattled its way through her, the crone began to wheeze. "Did she now? I think your aunt might just want to keep you out of the woods." She began walking off, paused as she realized the boy still wasn't following her. "Are you coming?" she asked, becoming slightly impatient. Just then, right on cue, the eerie howl of a distant wolf cut through the dense foliage. The boy squeaked, running to catch up with her. The crone nodded approvingly and began to lead the way through the dark woods. However, the boy quickly became hesitant to call it a forest at all, because the further they walked, the more moist and squishy the ground became. Soon the two of them were squelching their way through more than an inch of mud. The trees and vegetation began to droop towards the wet ground, and the very air developed a highly oppressive quality to it, as if it thoroughly enjoyed squeezing the very life out of him. These were no longer the friendly woods he knew. It had become a strange, otherworldly swamp. Sensing him tense beside her, the crone sighed. "This wasn't always a swamp," she said wistfully. "It used to be free from corruption, sacred. Now it withers. These woods used to be happy." The boy's head tilted to the side of its own accord. "Happy?" he asked, blinking. How could a forest possibly be happy? It couldn't think, couldn't feel things like people, could it? "Never mind," said the crone, shaking her head slowly. "None of that matters now. Look," she changed the subject, pointing ahead of her. "We're here." Looking up from the sodden mud below his feet, the boy paused, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. Before him was the largest tree that he had ever laid eyes on, so tall that he was pretty sure it touched the sky, and so wide that it would probably take the whole village locked hand in hand to reach all the way around its trunk. But tree though it may be, it was clearly a house of some description. Several windows covered by tattered strips of cloth, and what could have been a door, it was hard to tell being the same color of the wood around it, had been cut into the rough bark, and several bits of cotton or fabric of some description were strung on a line stretching from one of the low-hanging branches to the much smaller trunk of another tree. "Wow." The word crept out of his mouth before he could stop it. Another wheezy laugh reverberated through the heavy air before the crone almost had to double over as it abruptly turned into a cough. "One would think you'd never run into an old lady who lives in a tree before." "Are there many of you?" the boy asked, eyes widening. "We're more common than you think," she replied, a twinkle in her eye, which made it impossible to tell whether she was lying or not. "But let's not dally out here." She approached the door of the hovel, which might have blended perfectly into the tree if not for the windows on either side of it. "You look frozen to the bone." It was true that the boy was dreadfully cold, especially his feet, which were now encased in the freezing water that had snuck through his thin boots. But still, he paused. "Promise you won't eat me?" he said through the darkness. The crone rolled her eyes. "Yes, I promise," she huffed, pulling the door open with some difficulty. "Now come inside." She gestured into the even heavier darkness beyond the doorway. The boy took a deep breath. There was nothing to fear. She was just a nice old lady, after all, and he couldn't very well spend the night out here, could he? Gingerly, slowly, he stepped inside. Then the door closed behind him, leaving him in pitch blackness. He yelped, panicking for a moment. Oh, great goddess, she really was a witch. She'd lured him in so cleverly, and now she was going to eat him. "My," the crone's voice echoed through the space, "you are a skittish one. Just give me a second to find the light." The boy let out the breath he had been holding. For a moment he was sure she had tricked him. Out of the darkness, a warm, yellow light blossomed. It became much brighter as the crone turned around, lantern in hand, and the boy had to blink several times as his eyes adjusted to the wan light that danced feebly around the inside of the trunk. Surprisingly for an old woman who lived in a tree, the room was fairly regular, cluttered but homely. A small bed with a tattered quilt had been set neatly under a grimy window, across from which was a pot with something cooking in a thankfully stone fireplace. In the very middle was a round table with several rickety chairs strewn haphazardly around it, almost as if the crone had expected company. It was in one of these that said ancient woman sat in now, grunting as her old bones settled in. "Not what you expected?" she asked, smiling, the crow's feet beside her eyes crinkling as she saw the look of slight disappointment on his face. "It's just so," the boy began. "Normal?" "Yeah," he added solemnly. "I expected there to be at least one cauldron bubbling with eye of newt." The crone shook her head. "Still convinced I'm a witch, eh? Most people don't live in giant trees in the middle of swamps," he shrugged. His stomach began to growl then, completely of its own accord, as a stray breeze blew through an open window and wafted the gentle smell of whatever was cooking over the hearth directly into his nose. The sound must have been somewhat audible, for the crone began to cough uncontrollably as the boy turned to that alluring flavor. "You must be starving wandering around the woods like that," she croaked, still not completely recovered from her earlier coughing fit. Getting slowly to her feet, she grabbed a long spoon from its hook on the mantel and stirred the pot slowly. "Bowls are in the cabinet." She gestured over to the far corner. "Come get some." "What is it?" the boy asked. He must have made a strange face, because the crone rolled her eyes. "Relax," she said, turning back to him. "It's only rabbit stew." The boy's eyes widened. Rabbit stew was his favorite. He ran to the large wooden cabinet, which, now that he looked at it, seemed to be built into the wall, pushed past a few cobwebs, and grabbed a well-used wooden bowl. Curiously, he looked into the pot and was relieved to see that the contents looked like perfectly normal, albeit a little thick, stew. "Thank you," he said as the crone scooped him a big helping of the stuff. Generally, no one in the village, the boy included, usually bothered with manners, but this was an old woman who lived in a tree and could, more likely than not, turn him into a toad at will if she so desired. He could stand to be a little polite. Grunting in reply, the crone ladled herself a bowl, and they both sat down at the table. Neither of them really spoke as they ate, the boy because he was far too busy shoving spoonfuls of absolutely amazing stew into his mouth, the crone because she seemed to be lost in thought, examining his face curiously. The boy continued to glance around the hovel as he ate, and happened to catch sight of a single lone window which was not covered by a curtain. He blinked in surprise. "Hey," he said, "you can see the ruins from here." He pointed upwards through the window to where the skeletal remains of some ancient building slept like a giant necropolis. It almost seemed to glow through the trees of the forest. "You like the ruins?" she asked, sitting forward in her chair, which creaked under her. "Most people are scared of them." "I think they're cool." She smirked. "Do you know anything about them?" "I thought no one did." The boy shook his head. "Well, what am I then, chopped liver?" "You know something about the ruins?" asked the boy, excited. The crone chuckled. "Something. I'd say that I know more than anyone else alive." She sat back then, the front two legs of her chair rising off of the ground a few inches before settling back down again. Pausing for a moment, letting the tension build, the crone took a deep breath and began to speak. But her voice almost seemed different now, slower and smoother, a storytelling voice. "Have you heard the tale of the goddess?" she asked, and the boy nodded. "Of course," he said. "Everyone has. The goddess Danae created the world, and she lived in the ruins." Laughter once more. "She certainly didn't create the world, and she didn't live in the ruins either, but she did die there." "You make it sound like you knew her," said the boy, quickly becoming enraptured. The crone shrugged. "Once you tell a story enough, the characters almost become real, like a friend, or a sister, or brother, or daughter." A pause ensued as the crone became lost in thoughts for a moment, at least until the boy coughed and she shook herself. But I'm getting sidetracked. The goddess is only one part of the story. The rest is a legend that has been passed down through the generations long after her death, but I think it's been forgotten by now. Am I right? "I know some legends," began the boy, "but—" The crone cut him off with a wave of her hand. "No, if you know it, you would know it. It's the legend." She leaned forward, whispering now, as if the very words she was speaking were forbidden and secret. "They say that there is an evil, a beast, that lurks on the edge of reality." "Reality?" asked the boy, who had never heard of such a word in his life. Pausing again, the crone looked up to the ceiling as if it would have answers for her. "How do I explain it?" she muttered. "It comes from an other, a different place outside of our world, which makes our world reality." He still didn't understand, but the boy nodded anyway. "Anyway," the crone continued, "every so often the beast finds a way back into our world, and when he does, a hero is born, one who is destined to defeat the beast and banish him once again." "Wait a second," interrupted the boy. "If this hero is supposed to defeat the beast, then how does he know that he's the hero?" "Sometimes it's hard, and sometimes confusing, but each hero was born with the same name." The boy waited, but she didn't elaborate. "So the goddess," continued the boy, "was she a hero?" The crone chuckled. "Goodness, no. As much as she thought she could have been, she didn't have the courage, the guts. But she did know him, the first hero. If she was the face of the goddess, then he was the steel. Now," she frowned, "are you quite done interrupting?" "Just one more question," said the boy. "What does all of this have to do with the ruins?" Smiling, the crone sat back once again, clearly excited to have a real audience. "All in good time, my boy. All in good time."